time to take a good look at the Primaris troop choices open to us. Who's going to win out between Infiltrators, Incursors and Intercessors? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of your models on the tabletop. In today's video we'll be taking a more in-depth look at the 3 flavours of Primaris troop choices. We've covered all of these in their own individual videos, but I thought we'd do a little bit of comparison. First we'll take a bit of a look at their guns, and look at their efficiency against some likely targets, and then we'll look at the other benefits of the unit on the table. I think that all of these 3 can be compared quite easily, as they all have the same defensive profile essentially, with the standard Primaris stat line. Perhaps at some point at a later date we'll look at the relative merits of tactical marines and scouts compared with these guys, but we're going to stick with these 3 for this video, because frankly that's already quite a lot to talk about, and these guys compare quite easily. So first we're going to have a look at their guns then. We'll take a look at the amount of shots that you can fire for 100 points spent on each unit, so slightly less than an Infiltrator squad, slightly more than an Incursor squad, and roughly the same as you'd get for about 6 Intercessors, all give or take a few points, but we're more interested in the efficiency, as opposed to the actual raw numbers for a 5-man squad. We're going to count each weapon as firing its maximum number of shots available, which I think is reasonable. The bolt rifle can either rapid fire at 15 inches or rapid fire at 30 if it stays still, so it will likely be firing most of the time. The auto bolt rifle can fire all of its 3 shots up to 24 inches, so that's a good 30-inch threat range including movement, and the stalker bolt rifle has a very long range, so won't really need to move as much. As for the 2 bolt carbines carried by the Infiltrators and Incursors, I think that both of these will quite likely be able to get in rapid fire range because of their forward deployment options. We're also going to assume that each gun is firing in its own combat doctrine, so that's going to be tactical for all of the rifle variants and devastator for the stalker bolt rifle. If you're building a strategy around one of these guns, it means that you're more likely to be using it in its own given doctrine, though obviously it will alter the maths if you're using it outside of that. With all that being said, let's take a look at the numbers. So the targets that we're looking at are a guardsman in cover, an orc boy, an intercessor in cover, and a standard vehicle target with toughness 7 and a 3-up save. That covers a bunch of likely infantry they might be shooting against, and if they have no valid infantry targets then pitching in against vehicles might not hurt. So let's go through them quickly one by one. Firstly, against the guardsman, the auto bolt rifle wins handily. Those 3 shots really come into effect. The standard bolt rifle being next, then the bolt carbines, and the stalker bolt rifle trailing behind due to its low number of shots. The exact same trend is seen against the guardsman in cover. Decent differences between all the patterns of bolt rifles, but notably the Oculus bolt carbine gains a fair bit as it ignores cover. It's not quite enough to have it catch up with the bolt rifle, but it does get a lot closer. If we move on to looking at the orc boy now, again the auto bolt rifle wins handily, but second place is really quite close between the bolt rifle and the marksman bolt carbine, the one carried by the Infiltrators. This is because having the auto wounds on 6s rule is pretty handy against tough targets, and as the orc boy's save is so low, the extra AP of the bolt rifle doesn't come into effect. Next, if we look at the Intercessor and the Intercessor in cover, the stalker bolt rifle wins now, the flat 2 damage being a massive boon to it, plus the very decent AP actually coming into effect now it's shooting against an armoured target. Against the Intercessor out of cover, it's actually really quite a close contest between that and the auto bolt rifle. Just having all of those shots with AP -1 for tactical doctrine is quite a decent profile against most targets. The standard bolt rifle is next, and the carbines trail by quite a bit. If we look at the Intercessor in cover now, the bolt rifle and the auto bolt rifle are exactly the same, with the Oculus bolt carbine carried by the Infiltrators just a little bit lower on 1.75. It is quite a big deal to ignore cover when you're going from a 3-up save to a 2-up save. I'm afraid that the Infiltrators marksman bolt carbine is trailing by quite a lot on these targets. Low AP and few shots don't really help too much against a 2-up save. Finally, if we look at the vehicle, this is very similar efficiency to the Intercessor not in cover. Stalker bolt rifle winning, auto bolt rifle coming second, then regular bolt rifle, but it's worth noting that the marksman bolt carbine has a decent buff in this one because the target is so tough, so auto wounds are a lot more valuable. I think that the main take home from this table is that if you want damage output, then Intercessors are better. The two types of bolt carbine can be good against their individual targets, and they actually don't compare too badly on a model per model basis, but they lose a lot of efficiency because the models that carry them are a lot more expensive. I'd say the biggest overall winner for this table is probably the auto bolt rifle actually, provided it is in tactical doctrine. It is really efficient against a wide range of targets, though the standard bolt rifle doesn't follow that far behind. And of course the Stalker is very good against anything that's tough, but nowhere near as good against light infantry. However, I do think that damage output is only one of the considerations when you're comparing these units. In particular, the Infiltrators and Incursors mainly have their value in their special rules. So let's take a quick look at the various advantages of the three units, if we put aside raw firepower from their guns. Let's take a look at the Intercessors first. As we've already mentioned, they have the greatest damage output per point out of any of the units, but they also have the greatest durability per point, as they all have the same defensive profile, and the Intercessors are the cheapest. In a game that's mainly about damage output and durability, in terms of who can gun who off the table, this is really quite a big advantage to have. The Intercessors have a couple of unique options not available to the other units. Firstly, they have that auxiliary grenade launcher, a cheap 1-point upgrade that can let you fire a crack grenade at long range instead of your normal bolt rifle, which against several targets is a decent upgrade. The Sergeant can also take some fancy gear not available to the other units, namely things like Power Fists and Thunder Hammers, which are quite powerful on models with a lot of attacks. Obviously it depends on your tactics and strategy and how you're using them, but if you need them as a counter-attack threat, equipment like this can actually make them threaten vehicles and heavy infantry really quite well in close combat, rather than just being good against punchy up light infantry. The choice of bolt rifles is also a pretty powerful advantage. It means that Intercessors are a lot better at fitting in with your particular strategy in your particular army. For example, if you're playing Iron Hands or Imperial Fists, both armies that love to be in the Devastator doctrine, and have various benefits for heavy weapons, the Stalker bolt rifles might be the one to go for. On the other hand, if you're playing an assault-based army, like Blood Angels, and you want to be charging your Intercessors up the board, then the auto bolt rifles might be the ones to go for, as you can advance and still shoot them, and get them towards the enemy ready for a charge. You don't have this tailoring option available in the other two units, they just have the guns that they have and that's it. Another important point is the fact that they'll be easier to fill up battalions with and get those all-important command points, as they're the cheapest out of this comparison. Obviously things like Tactical Marines and Scouts are far cheaper, and they'll fill out your battalions even more efficiently, but if you're set on one of these three units, then it's certainly a consideration. Incursors aren't much more expensive, but Infiltrators are decently more expensive at 110 points versus the 85 of the bare bones Intercessor squad. Intercessors also have several unique stratagems that the other two squads don't have access to. Each of the bolt rifles has its own boosted stratagem, such as firing twice for the regular bolt rifle. You can also make them veteran Intercessors should you want to, and Intercessors are featured in a lot of the Vigilus detachments where the others aren't. These all give you more tactical options, the strongest ones in my mind being the unique stratagems for the bolt rifle and the Stalker bolt rifle. So that's Intercessors then. If we move on to Incursors now, who clock in at 19 points a model instead of the Intercessors 17. Their main advantage is the concealed positions rule, meaning that they can set up anywhere that's 9 inches from enemy models and the enemy deployment zone. Now this is a really powerful rule, and could be potentially worth those extra 2 points per model. It could potentially let you get first turn charges and disrupt the enemy battle plans, or just hold up enemy units or take midfield objectives. It will really let you position optimally, and can really screw with your opponent's battle plan, depending on the game that you're playing. In terms of their raw stat line abilities, we mentioned a bit about their ignoring cover ability with their bolt carbines in the maths comparison, but they also ignore negative to hit penalties as well. Now this will come up a bit less often when you're firing against infantry, but there are certain targets that are really quite important for this. Particularly Eldar Rangers are the first one that springs to mind, as an infantry unit that's typically riding at -2 to hit. These guys feel pretty much like they were made to kill Rangers, both ignoring their boosted cover save and negative to hit penalties, but it could certainly come up against other armies such as Alpha Legion or the Styges Admech Forge World that also gives you a -1 to hit. In close combat they also get a nice buff from their paired combat blades. This essentially equates to plus 25% hits, as each roll of a 6 will give you an additional hit. So if you are making 6 attacks, this benefit will give you an average of 5 hits rather than an average of 4. That's a solid buff to close combat, and it means that they're a little bit more dangerous point for point than the Intercessors are, if you're assuming that they're attacking light infantry and you haven't taken any of the Sergeant's close combat weapons. The same as the Infiltrators, they have smoke grenades, which can allow them to trade their shooting for a -1 to hit in the next turn, which could certainly be handy if they're trying to survive hell for leather on an objective or something. It might not be something that you use every game, as we all know that bolter shots are great and don't want to miss out on too many of them, but it's certainly an interesting tactical option. These guys have the Phobos keyword that works for certain psychic powers and warlord traits, so some abilities can target these guys that just can't target anyone else. Particularly things like the warlord trait from the Vanguard warlord traits table that allows units to redeploy can be useful, as can some librarian options, such as Temporal Corridor to get them extra movement, or the power that can make them not be hit unless they're the closest unit to the enemy models. Finally, they have the option for a Haywire Mine, which can be used to make the enemy take some mortal wounds if they move near to it, so for example putting it down on an objective could be pretty handy. It does cost 10 points though for something that might not ever be used, so it isn't without its opportunity cost. Finally, if we look at the Infiltrators perks, they have the same conceal positions, smoke grenades and Phobos synergies as the Incursors, but for me their big draw is their Omni Scramblers special rule. This makes them an excellent deep strike screen, as it means that enemy models can't set up within 12 inches of them if they're coming in from reserve. Most of the time this will mean that they can't be charged out of deep strike, and if you have a couple of units of these screening a large part of your army, it can really deny your opponent the option to get key charges off, or key shooting in place, which in certain matchups, like for example Genestealer Cult, could really turn the entire game. For me, this is the reason why you pay such a premium for these guys at 22 points a model, and I personally look at them more as units that can provide this nice wall of screening to your entire army, as opposed to just damage dealers or objective holders. They also have the option of the Helix Adept or the Infiltrator Comms Array. I'm not the biggest fan of the Helix Adept, as it might cost you shooting as much as it does buff your squad and heal it, and they are quite pricey. The comms array is a little bit more interesting, as it means that the squad's shooting efficiency gets a fair bit better if you have a Phobos Lieutenant and Captain on the table, and these guys can be elsewhere buffing other parts of your army at the same time. I still don't really see it as being massively efficient, as it's slightly buffing the damage output of a unit that doesn't have the greatest damage output in the first place, and again it does cost 10 points, so you do have to weigh it up against buying more Space Marines of one sort or another, and I think most of the time I'd probably just go for investing it in more Space Marines. It's certainly an interesting little option though. So overall, the Intercessors are great if you want a battle line unit that deals strong damage, can take the most amount of damage, and fill up battalions the easiest out of the Primaris units. The Infiltrators and Incursors have the advantages of the Phobos keyword, setting up closer to the enemy, and special rules depending on which unit you pick. I think that they're all really quite well pointed, and you do get pretty decent rewards based on what you pay for. If you want my personal opinion, I like the Intercessors best out of the Primaris troops. For me, I prefer to take scout squads over Incursors and Infiltrators, just because they're so cheap and have quite a lot of bolter shots point for point, and then I can take all of the saved points and invest them in heavier damage dealing units. That being said, if you did want to use an Intercessors type equivalent that could infiltrate, Incursors really aren't that much more expensive and have some interesting and useful special rules. And if you did want to absolutely provide the best deep strike denial screen ever, then Infiltrators are there. I could certainly see either of these units being run in competitive lists. The only thing is that I wouldn't go overboard on the Infiltrators. I'd take 2 to 3 squads tops to provide a decent screen and then just leave it at that. I'd really like to hear all of your guys' thoughts on comparing these three. Are the new Incursors or Infiltrators supplanting your Intercessors in your Space Marine armies, Or are Intercessors maintaining their crown as the standard Primaris battle line unit? Please let me know down in the comments. If there's anything else I've missed that's a significant advantage of any of these units, also please let me know. It'd be useful to hear any more information. As always, thank you for listening to Auspex Tactics. Feel free to subscribe if you'd like to hear more tactics focused 40k videos like this, or to support me on Patreon if you're finding my content useful. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.